Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. G'day friends and welcome to episode 56 of the podcast and the last episode of the year. Though I wasn't intending it to be released on the literal last day of the year, but here we are. Now it's been a wild ride to get to this point, and once again I want to thank everyone for their continued support. But in particular, I have to thank the podcast's Ko-Fi and Patreon backers, and in particular Alpha One, ATM and Mav, as well as to the Convicted Quokka, Doug Laporte, Grace and Wade for buying morale patches. Which brings me to my first announcement. The podcast now has merch. Thanks to Phil over at A1 Insignia Custom Embroidered Patches, the podcast now has an 8cm or 3.1 inch embroidered morale patch featuring an emu driving a Sentinel tank. With the words, I was only doing my job podcast around the outside. This is an homage to the Armoured Emu Brigade. The first run of the patch is already sold out, and actually sold out between my episode on Edward Atfield and this one, but I can announce that the second one has already arrived and is already selling quite well. It is available for purchase over on the podcast Ko-Fi store found at www.ko-fi.com/IWODMJ/shop. Now, there'll be a link to this in the show notes and on our website, as well as all the social media pages. As that was the main announcement, let's get started with the last episode of the year. During the First World War, the Australian Imperial Force had earned a well-established reputation for souveniring and trophy-taking. So much so that it was said that for every member of the AIF, they marched off into battle with a pocket full of museum labels. And at the end of the war, they had amassed a considerable collection through the Australian War Records section of over 25,000 individual objects, ranging in size from personal effects to the largest artillery pieces and vehicles, of which roughly 1,340 items were enemy guns and mortars, with most of these being captured during the last 100 days of the war. Now, something I've routinely said on TikTok and other places is that Australia had a reputation of collecting anything that wasn't bolted down, and those that were bolted, we would unbolt them, take it, and the bolts as well. But so effective was our collecting that British authorities actually commented that we had picked Europe clean. But of those relics collected from the battlefield, one has probably the most interesting story that most people don't realise is associated with it, and that is the largest object collected by the Australian Imperial Force, the Amiens railway gun. But before I delve into that story, I need to start at the beginning, specifically to 1905 and the commissioning of the pre-dreadnought battleship SMS Hessen. Now, in 1900, Germany and her newly established empire was identified as the chief foreign threat to the mighty British Empire. Germany, having unified in the 1870s, set to work to quickly make up for lost time and rapidly became the third largest empire in the world by 1884 by scooping up the portions of Africa and the Pacific that hadn't already been claimed by France, Denmark, the Netherlands, or Great Britain. Now, to protect this new overseas empire, Germany underwent a massive shipbuilding campaign, spurred on mainly by the two-century dominance of the waves by the Royal Navy. This caused alarm to spread throughout the British Empire, and a shipbuilding arms race soon began between the two powers, and to a lesser extent, the rest of the world's global powers, both established and emerging. Now, SMS Hessen was the third of 5 pre-dreadnought battleships of the Braunschweig class built for the Kaiserliche Marine, or the Imperial Navy, in 1902. This class was the first class of battleship built under the Second Naval Law, which was a massive German expansion program. Her main armament consisted of 4 28cm or 11-inch SK L40 Bruno guns in double turrets, one fore and one aft, and they were produced by the Krupp Armament Company. Just over a year after Hessen's launch, she was immediately rendered obsolete by HMS Dreadnought's launch and her arsenal of 10 12-inch guns. Despite this, Hessen was assigned to No. 2 Battle Squadron of the German Active Battle Fleet. The force was later renamed the High Seas Fleet, and she joined 8 other battleships. Hessen's pre-war service comprised predominantly of fleet reviews, squadron, and fleet maneuvers, though on one occasion she was part of a receiving party for Tsar Nicholas II and won the Kaiser's shooting prize for excellent gunnery. Just before the war, she collided with the Danish steamer SS Askund in 1910 and the German torpedo boat G110 in 1913. In 1914, the German Navy had plans to retire all of its older pre-dreadnoughts, and as a result, Hessen was scheduled to be withdrawn from service on the 26th of August, 1914. The war, however, interrupted that plan, and Hessen remained with the High Seas Fleet as the oldest ship in service. Like most capital ships in the North Sea during the First World War, her warwick service prior to the Battle of Jutland comprised of refits, exercises, and attempts to draw out their opposing fleet into battle, and this was done by bombarding the British ports of Yarmouth and Lowestoft. She also spent a considerable amount of time guarding the Danish Straits. The already obsolete SMS Hessen participated in the Battle of Jutland from the 31st of May to the 1st of June 1916, serving alongside 5 vessels of the pre-dreadnought Deutschland class. Unfortunately, the age and speed of the pre-dreadnoughts meant they fell well behind the rest of the High Seas Fleet, and served as a tactical disadvantage as they simply just could not keep up. Hessen and the rest of No. 2 Battle Squadron would serve as a crucial blocking force to cover the withdrawal of the main German battle line at the end of the first day of fighting. At 3 a.m., Hessen and the rest of the pre-dreadnoughts came under attack by a group of British destroyers that had managed to sneak close enough unseen to torpedo the SMS Pommern, one of the Deutschland-class ships. Thinking that submarines were responsible, the squadron responded in kind and started attacking any object they presumed to be a submarine, whether it was debris or marker buoys. In total, Hessen fired her main armaments 5 times during the course of the battle, and most of that was at debris. While both sides claimed victory after the only major naval engagement of the First World War, the experience of Jutland proved inevitably that the pre-dreadnought battle wagons were more of a hindrance than a help to the modern battle fleet. So, Hessen and the rest of the pre-dreadnoughts were withdrawn from service, so that their crews could be used more effectively elsewhere. Hessen then served as a guard ship, a target ship, and then finally on the 12th of December 1916, after 11 years in the fleet, she was decommissioned, her armaments were removed, and she now served as the depot ship for the 1st Submarine Flotilla. While her active naval service in the Great War was now over, there was still a place where she could still serve. While 4 11-inch guns would make little tactical benefit in the naval combat, when mounted to railway wagons, the kind of firepower would have proved invaluable on the static battlefields of the Western Front. And as a result, in total, 20 11-inch railway guns would be converted from the main armaments of the battleships SMS Braunschweig, Hessen, Preußen, Deutschland, Schlesien, and Schleswig-Holstein, and paired with railroad firing platform mounts successfully used by other German railroad guns. For the most part, the German Navy retained most of these for coastal defensive purposes, and as a result, only 2 were actually handed over to the Imperial German Army. These guns were handed over to Battery 746 and the Bavarian Battery 1005. The gun that would become the Amiens gun was paired with mounting number 7 and was assigned to the Bavarian Battery. These guns would be crucial in 1918. At the start of the year, Germany was faced with a rapidly closing window. With Russia's withdrawal from the war through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany now all of a sudden had 50 divisions that they could shift to the Western Front that momentarily gave them the advantage in numbers before the promised 1 million American reinforcements arrived to become a serious threat to their chances of winning, and as such, they launched the Spring Offensive. The Spring Offensive comprised of 4 separate attacks, codenamed Michael, Georgette, Gneisenau, and Blucher York. Michael was the main attack, which was intended to break through the Allied lines, outflank the British forces, which held the front from the Somme River to the English Channel, defeat the British Army, and then once that was achieved, it was hoped that the French would seek armistice terms. The other offensives were subsidiary to Michael and were designed to divert Allied forces away from the main offensive fronts on the Somme. To support this attack, Germany had amassed 3,534 heavy trench mortars and 6,608 guns of various types. Among the latter were 73 long-range rail and other super heavy guns. Now, the super heavy guns had to be transported in sections by rail for final assembly at specially prepared firing positions, while most of the railway guns could fire while still on the rail line. These long-range weapons, combined with the large territorial gains made between March and June 1918, had actually enabled Germany to target areas well behind the Allied front line, previously inaccessible. This included major cities and towns, and one of the targets was the vital railway and communications hub of Amiens. It was bombarded between April and August by railway guns, and in particular the gun that would become known as the Amiens gun, though at the time it was known as Bruno or Little Bruno. The initial attack of the Spring Offensive fell in the British sector of the line around the Somme and the British Fifth Army under General Hubert Gough, and as the Allies were steadily pushed back towards Amiens, the Australian divisions were moved south from Messines to help shore up the line, joining other Dominion forces to blunt the attack near Dernancourt. After the initial advance, partly due to logistical problems, Germany struggled to maintain their momentum. Their fast-moving elite stormtrooper units could not carry enough food or ammunition to sustain themselves for long periods of time, and the rest of the German army could not move in supplies and reinforcements fast enough to assist them or exploit their gains. The Allies, in response, concentrated their main forces in essential areas, mainly the approaches to the Channel ports and the rail junction of Amiens. Strategically worthless ground, which had been devastated by years of conflict, was lightly defended and thus easily taken, though within a few weeks the danger of a German breakthrough had passed. Though related fighting continued until the 18th of July, even before that date, the Allies, in particular the Dominion forces of Australia, New Zealand and Canada, were already making territorial gains to recapture the territory that had been lost. On the 11th of April 1918, elements of the 1st Australian Division, having arrived from Flanders, were boarding trains at Amiens for a rapid redeployment to reinforce the city of Hasbrouck near the French-Belgian border. As this was happening, a German long-range gun started shelling the railway station and introduced the Australians to the Amiens gun for the first time. From May to July, German high-velocity guns continued to be a source of harassment on the Villers-Bretonneux front. The shorter-range guns that the Germans used were quickly neutralized once their locations were discovered by British 6-inch and 60-pounder guns. To counter this, German gunners would fire off several rounds on Allied positions and retire before the Allied counter-batteries answered, though mostly they weren't so lucky. The same wasn't necessary for the larger German guns like the Amiens gun. With a range of 21,875 yards or 20 kilometers, they could simply sit back well behind the line and shell Allied positions with impunity. An even larger gun, a 35cm or 14-inch gun, mounted at Chuings, roughly 17 kilometers from the Amiens gun, joined the fray from early June with devastating effect. With the Amiens gun in play during the spring offensive, allow me to introduce you to the three men responsible for her capture: George Burrows, John Henry Palmer, and Leslie James Strahan. George Burrows was born on 19th of June 1890 in my hometown of Penrith, New South Wales, the son of Edward Charles, a railway engineer, and Robina Burrows. He attended the Penrith Superior Public School before undergoing a civil engineering degree through the Sydney Technical College and an apprenticeship at the Naval Dockyards in Sydney. At the outbreak of the First World War, when Burrows enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force on the 12th of July 1915 as part of the 10th Reinforcements to the 1st Field Company Engineers, he was working as a civil engineer associated with the New South Wales Railway Department. His two brothers, Henry John and Norman Charles Burrows, would enlist in the Australian Imperial Force the following year, in 1916. The other two men who were responsible for the capture of the Amiens gun were John Henry Palmer and Leslie Strahan, as I mentioned. Both of these men were born in 1893, but on opposite sides of the country. Palmer was born in St Arnaud, Victoria, to John Fielding Palmer and Martha Ann Bennett, and Strahan was born in Guildford, Western Australia, to James Strahan and Mary Ann Bishop, the second youngest of four. Strahan's father, James, sadly passed away in 1899, his mother later marrying George Cousins, resulting in two more children. At the time of the First World War, the Palmers had moved to Ipswich, Queensland, due to John Henry being hired as an apprentice to the Ipswich Railway Workshops in 1910 before he became a boilermaker in 1915. He would join the Australian Imperial Force on the 20th of March 1916 as part of the 4th Reinforcements to the 4th Pioneers. Strahan was working as a contractor in Three Springs from 1911 to 1912 before, according to census data, from 1914 he was working as a farmer, presumably on his mother's property at Reno at the outbreak of the war. Though interestingly though, on his enlistment paperwork when he joined the Australian Imperial Force for the first time, on the 2nd of June 1915 as part of the 7th Reinforcements to the 16th Australian Infantry Battalion, he listed his profession as a motor driver, and according to interviews done by Palmer after the war, he was employed in that capacity with the Western Australian Railways. Strahan was initially discharged from the Australian Imperial Force as medically unfit on the 6th of January 1916 due to an exacerbation of pre-existing conditions, namely laryngitis, pharyngitis, and rhinitis. For 6 months, he then worked at the 8th Australian General Hospital in Fremantle before once again rejoining the Australian Imperial Force on the 10th of July 1916, and this time he was assigned to the 6th Reinforcements to the 3rd Pioneer Battalion on the 2nd of December. George Burrows departed for overseas service on the 6th of September 1915 aboard the troop ship HMAT A-70 Ballarat as a sapper and landed on Gallipoli just in time to be evacuated. Upon returning to Alexandria, he would be taken on strength with the 14th Field Company. On the 18th of June 1916, Burrows boarded the transport ship HMT Kinfons Castle, bound for the Western Front, and arrived in Marseille, France on the 29th before boarding trains for Hasbrook in Flanders for acclimatization and training in the area known as the Nursery Sector. While Burrows was getting used to trench warfare on the Western Front, Private John Palmer was boarding the transport ship HMAT A-50 Itonis on the 8th of August, arriving in Plymouth, England on the 18th of October. 2 months later, Percy Leslie Strahan would board HMAT A-34 Persec on the 29th of December and arrived in Devonport, England on the 3rd of March the following year. Both men would receive more specialised training in England before they too proceeded to France. Palmer on the 29th of November 1917 as part of the 8th Field Company Engineers, and Strahan on the 31st of October as part of the 3rd Field Company Engineers. As this was happening for the first half of 1917, Burrows was also undergoing additional training, though his would eventually result in his promotion to second lieutenant on the 3rd of May. He then travelled to France once more on the 21st of May and was taken on strength once again with the 14th Field Company on the 3rd of June. In July 1917, Burrows also anecdotally has the distinction of being the first on scene at the crash of the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. When in France, all 3 field companies were employed across the Australian positions, reinforcing trenches, laying duckboards and communications wire, building and repairing structures, as well as establishing strongpoints and destroying German fortifications. Now, as a rule, field companies weren't deployed as a unit, but were assigned piecemeal to other Allied forces in a supporting capacity to provide skilled engineering support as required. Now, this has made the specific actions undertaken by these 3 men in the war rather difficult to pin down, but what I can confirm is they all undertook periods of leave back in London and conducted themselves in an appropriate manner. During 1917, Strahan would be hospitalised with the mumps, and Burrows would receive the Military Cross for, quote, conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. He constructed a strong point under heavy fire and for 4 days supervised the wiring of a brigade front in spite of heavy counterattacks. He showed great coolness and determination, unquote. He also would be promoted to full lieutenant. By the end of the year, Strahan would be assigned to the 8th Field Company, joining Palmer. Following the success of the Battle of Hamel on the 4th of July and other smaller-scale offensives, on the 15th of July, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, visited Supreme Allied Commander General Ferdinand Foch to discuss the future conduct of the war. As the spring offensive had ground to a halt by this point, the intent of this meeting was to seize the initiative and to go on the offensive. The commander of the British Fourth Army, Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson, of which the Australian Corps was a part of, had been pushing for more offensive operations on the Villers-Bretonneux Plateau, the area in which the Australians were conducting peaceful penetration operations. One of these would result in the capture of Mephisto later in the year. Now, as I've mentioned previously, the success of the peaceful penetration operations were both a source of morale for the Australian forces and a source of constant frustration for the British High Command. Commander of the Australian Corps, General Sir John Monash, informed Rawlinson that the Australian Corps was ready to undertake a longer-term offensive, but he was concerned about the security of his flanks. This was mainly due to his prevailing poor opinion of the British units that surrounded him. When Rawlinson suggested the Canadian Corps be reassigned to the Australian flank, Monash reportedly jumped at the opportunity. The decision to utilise both the Australian and Canadian corps for what would become the Battle of Amiens was vital to the success of the whole operation. Both corps were experienced and extremely battle-worthy. By comparison, most of the British and French forces that surrounded them had by this time been battered and their strength diluted by men less fit, both physically and emotionally due to mutinies and conscription. As a result, a friendly rivalry also existed between the Australian and Canadian commands. Quote, the Australians were darlings of the press and received constant publicity. Their wide-brimmed slouch hats seemed to typify their flamboyant style and made for eye-catching photos. They were perceived as rugged men, possessed in battle by a fierce joy and a readiness to take risks. They were crafty and clever and had an eye for the ground and for the foe's weaknesses, unquote. The Canadians, by comparison, received much less publicity than their younger Dominion, but were nonetheless popular wherever they served. The Canadians also had a much longer experience with the horrors and evolving battlefield conditions of the Western Front since they joined it in 1914, and had tempered their initial indiscipline and operational experience, and were now one of the finest fighting forces in the Allied Army by 1918, and serving with distinction along the lines of the Australian Corps and the New Zealand Division. This upcoming battle would also be the first time the two Dominions would fight alongside each other. Previously, the Australians had just fought alongside the New Zealanders. However, when Rawlinson approached Monash with the idea, this operation had more or less already been decided about 2 months earlier when Haig met Foch. A lot of the tactics that were going to be used in the upcoming battle were tested, albeit on a much smaller scale, at the successful Australian counteroffensive at Hamel on the 4th of July. Now, the date of the new offensive was going to be slated for the 8th of August 1918, a date that would be significant for the conduct of the First World War. Officially, the battle would be known as the Third Battle of Picardy, though historically it's mainly known by its other name, the Battle of Amiens. The battle would have 3 sequential objectives. The first, called the Green Line, was at a position to the west of Wafusset. The second, called the Red Line, was just to the west of Habenez. The third and final objective, known as the Blue Line, which was also the closest to its previous objective, was on the eastern side of the city at the old Amiens Defensive Line when this area was defended during the battles of the Somme. On the eve of the Battle of Amiens, General Monash issued a message to all the troops of the Australian Corps. Quote, "For the first time in the history of this Corps, all 5 Australian divisions will tomorrow engage in the largest and most important battle operation ever undertaken by the Corps. They will be supported by an exceptionally powerful artillery and by tanks and aeroplanes on a scale never previously attempted. The full resources of our sister Dominion, the Canadian Corps, will also operate on our right, with 2 British divisions will guard our left flank. Because of the completeness of our plans and dispositions, of the magnitude of the operations, of the number of troops employed, and of the depth to which we intend to overrun the enemy's positions, this battle will become one of the most memorable of the whole war, and there can be no doubt that, by capturing our objectives, we shall inflict blows upon the enemy which will make him stagger, and will bring the end appreciably nearer." Unquote. On the night of the 7th of August, the Allied line was quiet, as the 3 Corps lay in wait for the morning, as reflected by gunner J.R. Armitage in his diary. Quote, "It was utterly still. Vehicles made no sound on the marshy ground. The silence played on our nerves a bit. We got our guns into position and we could hear drivers whispering to their horses and men muttering curses under their breath. And still the silence persisted, broken only by the whine of a stray rifle bullet or a long-range shell passing overhead. We could feel that hundreds of groups of men were doing the same thing, preparing for the heaviest barrage ever launched." Unquote. At 0420 hours on the 8th of August 1918, through the fog, the Allied positions around Amiens erupted with a devastating barrage of 1,386 field guns and howitzers and 684 heavy guns as a mass of assembled Allied forces, including Australians, Canadians, British and French, sprung forth from the trenches to launch an offensive to push through the German lines and hopefully through to victory. It involved the 1st French and 4th British armies, but was led by a combined Australian and Canadian force, with the Australian 2nd and 3rd Divisions operating side by side alongside 3 Canadian divisions doing the same. The British 3rd Corps attacked to the north of the River Somme, the Australian Corps at the centre of the south of the river, the Canadian Corps to the right of the Australian position. Further to the south, the French 1st Army launched its own attack in support of the battle. In total, the Allied forces would be supported by 508 tanks, of which 24 were intended as supply tanks to bring up equipment and ammunition. This gathering of armour comprised every available tank in the British Expeditionary Force at that time. To accomplish the battle, each Australian infantry brigade was provided with a company of engineers, along with additional support elements including a detachment of tanks to support each of the 4 frontline brigades as General Monash outlined. The open warfare infantry brigades were provided out of their own divisional resources, a company of engineers, a company of machine guns, a field ambulance, and a detachment of pioneers, so that, in the most complete sense, they became a brigade group of all arms, capable of dealing, out of their own resources and on their own ground, any situation that might arise." Unquote. For this battle, the 31st Australian Infantry Battalion was assigned a detachment of the 8th Field Company, and for this battle, Lieutenant Burrows was temporarily reassigned from the 14th to the 8th Field Company. Because of the advances in range finding, noise detection, and aerial reconnaissance, the initial artillery barrage was conducted without the normal ranging fire that had been used previously to ensure accurate gunfire. This resulted in 503 of 530 German gun emplacements being knocked out in the opening salvo before the British, Australian, and Canadian guns reverted to a creeping barrage to support the advance. Due to the thick smoke and fog caused by the morning mist and the artillery barrage, most of the attacking forces became separated from each other and resorted to following the noise of battle under the direction of any officer, NCO, or natural leader who took responsibility to direct them. But for the most part, in the era before modern optics, they pressed on blindly, following any eastward road or rail line they came across, sometimes literally falling onto German machine gun teams and infantry huddled in shell craters. By 0600, the mist and fog had started to lift, and the assaulting units were able to reform, reorientate, and continue the attack. And as the fog cleared even further, it was reported by numerous Australian infantry battalions that the tanks that were supporting them, which had been operating solely by sound by this point, had started to reorientate themselves and then straight for resistance wherever they saw it. Though tanks have seemed to have captured the imagination of the Germans, the Australian armoured cars also delivered an excess of death and destruction on the Germans in their sector. Undertaking deep reconnaissance for General Monash, 4 cars managed to surprise German soldiers sitting at their breakfast in Proyat. Unsurprising, the raid they'd caused created panic amongst the German transports and may have actually hampered the movements of German reinforcements back to the front line. The Australian and Canadian forces captured their first objectives, the Green Line positions around Marcelcave, in about 2 hours, and by 0820 the second wave, comprising of the fresh 4th and 5th Australian Divisions and the 4th Canadian Division, leapfrogged their brothers and exploited the break in the line to head for the Red Line, the limit of the second phase beyond the Morcourt Valley, but short of the city of Amiens. It was at this point during the battle that the photo of the 17 men of Amiens, as featured back in Season 1, was taken for the second phase, the capture of Wavre-Arboncourt. It was also at this time that the 31st Australian Infantry Battalion joined the battle. As the Allied forces made their way eastward, they routinely came across groups of German soldiers and artillerymen who, shaken by the suddenness and ferocity of the attack, simply surrendered, with official reports scoring hundreds and even thousands of men surrendering en masse, while others stuck to their posts until they were flanked. Even with the ongoing battle, a number of German positions were actually taken via peaceful penetration operations. As this was happening, Allied artillery batteries limbered up their guns to horse teams or tractors and moved to secondary positions to continue supporting the infantry. Engineering field companies loaded their general service wagons with water and supplies and followed the advance, repairing roads and destroying obstacles in the back area. Up above, due to the clearing skies, aircraft of the Australian Flying Corps and the newly formed Royal Air Force started conducting sorties, as well as dropping smoke bombs in front of villages and ridgelines that had been marked as positions of German artillery. Mainly, these guns had been missed by the opening salvo or were initially out of range. While they were doing this, they were also strafing and harassing German units in the rear. For the most part, most of these missed batteries were dealt with by the advancing tanks or by aircraft. While the Australians were able to make impressive gains and reach their Red Line objectives relatively quickly, the Canadian and British forces were facing obstacles, mainly terrain and fresh German positions, which slowed their advance. By 1210, the Australian divisions had reached the Blue Line and the old Amiens defensive positions. For the 31st Australian Infantry Battalion, they settled into defensive trenches dating back to the first battles on the Somme, opposite Framerville, roughly 3 kilometres east of Amiens. As some soldiers removed their breakfast rations and started eating, the assigned engineers went to work erecting wire defences and shoring up trenches while preparing reserve positions. Just beyond their front line sat a German rail hub on an open plateau that had been used by a supply dump. It possessed a pair of light railway lines and a standard gauge track. The 2 smaller trains were hurriedly steaming to the southeast towards Valvers, but the one train in particular drew everyone's attention. It was a standard gauge locomotive with a huge humpbacked truck in the middle, from which several times expanded a cloud of tawny smoke. The hump was seen to be a large railway gun, which was actually still shooting. Eventually, as the gunners realized how close the Allies had become, the engineer actually decided to get the train out of there and tried to shunt it to another line. Unfortunately, at this time, the train garnered the attention of a pair of Sopwith Camels of 201 Squadron Royal Air Force, who dove on it using bombs and machine guns. They set a number of pieces of rolling stock on fire, as well as disabling the locomotive in a plume of steam. This was immediately followed by the attack of the 5th Dragoon Guards moving through the Australian lines, who then charged 6 kilometres into German positions. After taking heavy casualties and having to regroup, they charged once again and drove off the crew of the rail yard and took between 200 and 300 prisoners from the surrounding area, which started to make their way towards the Australian lines at 1 p.m. The Dragoons, unable to stick around the Amiens gun as they had to push on to Framerville to cover the Australian advance, As a result, B Company of the 31st Australian Infantry Battalion took possession of the railway gun and train and claimed it as a trophy. Now, things at this point start to get a little sticky, brought on by the fact that unit diaries are almost always written after the fact. But this is the reason why I've long since suspected that the capture of the Amiens gun is actually the inspiration for what people think happened with the capture of Mephisto. The 31st Australian Infantry Battalion's unit diary relating to the Battle of Amiens refers to the event as, quote, "On arriving at the Blue Line, it was seen that there was a train with heavy gun and crew on the line in XIC, at the rear end of which was burning as a result of a bomb being dropped by one of our combat planes. The crew, including the second in command of the gun, were captured by the 5th Dragoon Guard, and also numerous other details such as AA gun crews." Unquote. For the 8th Field Company, the unit diary adds this to it with, quote, "On reaching the Blue Line, Lieutenant Burrows plus 2 sappers went forward to a railway siding in front of the final objective to where a 11.2-inch German railway gun, 2 ammunition wagons, 2 armoured coaches, plus other carriages abandoned by the enemy were standing. The carriages at the end of the train were on fire. These were disconnected and shunted clear. Steam was raised and railway gun coupled to wagon of ammunition plus 2 armoured coaches were brought behind our own lines to a point of the line about W5 contains where the rail has also been broken by shell fire." Unquote. XIC and W5 refer to map coordinates used during the Battle of Amiens. XIC, as far as I've been able to determine, roughly relates to a position near Framerville, and W5 is the rail line located to the north of Amiens. More context actually comes from Sapper John Palmer, who was interviewed well after the war. Quote, "We had been sent with a quantity of ammonol to blow up the large gun. However, Les Strahan, one of our sappers in the party, had been a driver in the West Australian Railways, and he found there was still a head of steam. He asked for a fair go. Instead of blowing up the gun, he got the engine going, and we were told to try and get it back if possible into a cutting so it would be camouflaged." Unquote. Now, after reading the 3 war diaries for the 8th Field Company, the 31st Battalion, and the 8th Brigade in regards to the Battle of Amiens, and going over the force disposition maps of the 31st Battalion's area of responsibility, it's clear that, for the most part, the German rail line ran parallel to the old Amiens defensive positions, which meant that all 21 metres of carriage, plus locomotive and other rolling stock of the disabled Amiens gun, which would have blocked the line of sight of a considerable portion of the Australian front line, as the gun itself was also nearly 5 metres tall. This could have caused serious strategic issues for the Australians, as it would have allowed German forces to close within 370 metres of the Australian lines. Now, that's roughly as tall as the Empire State Building or 3 football fields. That's both American and rugby. While the actual exchange is lost to history, I can only guess how the conversation went between Officer Commanding 31st Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Neil Freeman, and Lieutenant Burrows, who was in charge of the engineers attached to his battalion, but I suspect it was along the lines of, "get rid of it," as was doctrine at the time. This is part of the reason why Major Robinson of the 26th Battalion, during the Battle of Monument Wood, sought permission to recover Mephisto from the battlefield, the prevailing concern that it could have been used to give shelter to advancing German troops. For the Amiens gun, however, Burrows subsequently would call for volunteers, and Strahan and Palmer stepped forward, and all 3 men would have set off with their quantity of ammonol with the intent of destroying it. It wasn't until they reached the gun and performed an assessment that it appears that Strahan has requested the recovery instead. The more I read about the Amiens gun, the more I see similarities between its capture and the popular though incorrect interpretation of the capture of Mephisto. And to answer any lingering questions, the Australian Corps during the Battle of Amiens was not issued a rum ration for this battle. And while captured German officers complained of drunken behaviour, official historians refute this by stating that's more to do with having their own private stashes of cognac and schnapps being confiscated by the trophy-hungry AIF than any dastardly behaviour. And for those wondering, ammonol is a highly explosive material made from a combination of TNT and ammonium nitrate, which only serves to prove that the gun was supposed to be destroyed, not captured. Strahan was able to get the locomotive back up to steam, and word was sent back to the Australian line for more engineers to repair the rail line. Over the course of the night of the 8th, water was acquired to fill the engine, repairs were done to the locomotive and bogies, and the burning rolling stock was shunted out of the way so that by morning, the Amiens gun was able to be hitched to the locomotive and was moved to the Australian lines to a position north of Amiens. The fact the rolling stock was still on fire is still impressive because all the accounts that I've seen has it said as the stock was burning, not that it had been burnt. In regards to the recovery of the Amiens gun, the 8th Field Company's unit diary gives a rather droll and monosyllabic response. Quote, A party of one section of sappers was put on during the night of 8th 9th to repair BG Railway in line W50. This necessitated taking out damaged sections of rail and replacing them with rails taken up from line between W5 Centre and Blue Line. Rails that would not fit were successfully cut with one slot of gun cotton placed vertically with edge of slab in case of contact with web of rail. As boiler of locomotive attached to railway gun was practically empty, 300 gallons of water was taken up in water cart from Bayonne Villas during the night. Steam was raised early in the morning of the 9th, but when starting locomotive on upgrade, the train ran back a few yards with the result that bogies of gun carriage ran off the rails on one side. Work was then commenced jacking up carriage and eventually gun carriage was replaced on rails. Another 300 gallons of water was taken up by Loco and Company water cart from Bayonne Villas during the evening. Steam was again raised and gun and train moved back to W3DS89 during the night of 8th 9th August 18. Early morning of the 10th of August 18, Lieutenant Malcolm R.E. arrived from Corps headquarters with instructions to take over gun and train, where were handed over receipt obtained from him, unquote. There's about 6 full stops in that whole exchange, and I still have no idea what the phrase cut with one slot of gun cotton placed vertically with edge of slab in case of contact with web of rail means. So anyone who has any idea what that means, please let me know. As the Amiens gun sat behind the Australian lines, word quickly spread amongst the Allied positions that this massive piece of equipment had been captured by the Australians, and this was a full 8 days before the 26th Battalion captured Mephisto. To commemorate this, and something that was repeated by the 26th Battalion, as reported by Burrows after the war, quote, "There was one amusing incident in connection with which I had better make the position clear. I was an officer of the 14th Field Company, 5th Division Engineers, and was on loan to the 8th Field Company only for the attack. I was on loan to them and when the gun was captured. After the gun had been taken behind our lines, the OC of the 8th Field Company sent a man up with a pot of white paint, and he painted on the side of the gun in large letters, captured by the 8th Field Company. Naturally, the seizure of such a big gun, with the bogies it weighed 185 tons, excited some interest. Besides, it was the gun that the Germans had brought up specifically to shell Amiens. Well, when the announcement of the 8th Field Company appeared on it, the OC of the 31st Battalion was not satisfied. As soon as he spotted it, he sent along another man with another pot of paint, and the first announcement was painted out, and the new words painted on, captured by the 31st Battalion. It was interesting, as well as amusing, but the fact that I was not under the orders of the CO of the 31st Battalion, but was under the orders of the OC of the 8th Field Company, although really an officer of the 14th Field Company, unquote. From Amiens, the railway gun moved to Paris and it was exhibited in the Champs-Élysées, where it attracted considerable crowds. For the Battle of Amiens, it was an overwhelming Allied victory and marked the start of the 100 Days Offensive, which eventually saw the defeat of Germany in the First World War. The cost, however, was high, with 21,243 Allied casualties, of which 1/4 would be killed in action. For the Germans, however, the losses in men and material was much greater and something they could not replace, with 30,000 casualties and 29,144 prisoners, along with 338 guns and 116 towns and villages liberated. In response to the Battle of Amiens, Quartermaster General of the Imperial German Army, General Erich von Ludendorff, stated that the 8th of August 1918 was, quote, "the black day of the German army in the history of this war. Everything I had feared, and of which I had so often given warning, had here, in one place, become a reality," unquote. In response to this battle, General Monash was knighted following the engagement. He was the first officer knighted in the field by the reigning monarch in 200 years. For Burrows, Palmer, and Strahan, all three would be recommended for awards of gallantry. Burrows was recommended for the Distinguished Service Order, quote, "for conspicuous bravery, initiative, and devotion to duty." On the 8th of August, this officer was in charge of a section of sappers accompanying one of the assaulting battalions on the left brigade in the attack east of Villers-Bretonneux near Amiens. On the final objective being reached east of Habanères, a long-range 11.5-inch gun on railway mounting was seen on a siding 400 yards beyond the front line. A locomotive with several ammunition wagons and coaches which were on fire was also on the siding. Without hesitation, Lieutenant Burrows and 2 sappers went forward, and in spite of enemy machine gun and rifle fire, raised steam on the locomotive, shunted the burning coaches into another siding, coupled up with the gun and ammunition wagons, and then brought these back well within our own lines. His great courage and initiative in the face of the enemy resulted in the capture of an extremely valuable gun, ammunition, and locomotive, and is destined for highest recognition, unquote. Now, both Palmer and Strahan were both recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal and shared the same recommendation, just the names were different. Quote, for conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty, in the attack east of Villers-Bretonneux near Amiens on the 8th of August, Sapper Palmer, Sapper Strahan, was in a section accompanying the assaulting battalion. On the final objective being reached east of Habanez, a long-range 11.5-inch gun on railway mounting was seen on a siding 200 yards beyond front line. A locomotive with several ammunition wagons and coaches which were on fire were also on the siding. Without hesitation, this man volunteered and went forward with his section officer, and in spite of enemy machine gun and rifle fire, assisted to raise steam on the locomotive, shunt the burning coaches onto another siding, couple up with gun and ammunition wagons, and bring these safely back into our own lines. His great courage and determination in the face of the enemy resulted in the capture of an extremely valuable gun and locomotive, and is worthy of the highest recognition, unquote. As was common at the time of the First World War, whenever groups of soldiers were involved, the officer was generally awarded a higher award than the soldiers beneath them, even if the soldier responsible was not the officer in charge. Regardless of the second largest war trophy being collected, all three men had their recommendations downgraded. Burrows received a bar to his military cross, while Palmer and Strahan received the military medal. Burrows would return to the 14th Field Company on the 12th of August, and Strahan would be wounded in the shoulder in September before contracting mumps for a second time. For Lieutenant Burrows, tragedy would strike his family with the death of his brother Henry John Burrows, who died of wounds on the 2nd of September. None of these men would encounter the Amiens gun again. By 1919, all three men were on their way back to Australia. Palmer was the first to depart, leaving in early 1919 aboard the transport Leicestershire, and would be discharged almost a year to the day from the Amiens gun's capture. Palmer would be followed by Burrows, who boarded the transport ship Durham on the 22nd of May and was discharged on the 20th of September. Strahan returned to Australia aboard the steamship Congjin Luz on the 21st of June, disembarking in Fremantle, West Australia on the 2nd of August, and was discharged the following day. Palmer resumed work in the Ipswich Railway Workshop, and Burrows returned to work as a civil engineer in Sydney, working in connection with the New South Wales Government Railway Department. Strahan, from this point on, becomes a bit of an enigma, as all is known until 1921 was that he was living in Fremantle when he announced his wedding to Helen Watson Murray on the 1st of October. While it sat in Paris, the branding applied to it by the soldier of the 31st Battalion had been painted over and replaced with the wording, "Captured by British 4th Army," and this is how it stayed until it was taken to London by Channel Ferry. When it arrived, unspecified modifications were conducted on it to allow it to use the English railway system, and was taken to the Woolwich Arsenal for examination and testing by the British naval and army experts. While it was there, a plethora of claims and counterclaims pertaining to the eventual ownership of the weapon was sent before the War Trophies Committee, where its fate was decided. The Royal Air Force was the first to challenge the 31st Battalion's claim on the grounds that it was their Sopwith Camels that had mobilised the gun. The next claim came from both British and Canadian cavalry units, who decreed that it was their mounted chargers who drew off the crews. The Royal Engineers wanted the gun because it was their work to repair the tracks that aided in its recovery, and the French government, keen to claim the weapon for their own, made the counterclaim that because it was captured on French soil and had done material damage to Albert, Amiens, and other towns at the forward area, it deserved to stay in France. Ultimately, the decision pertaining to what is now known as the Amiens gun, though at the time it was referred to as Little Bruno or the Habanez gun, was that it would be sent to Australia as a trophy, on the proviso that it could actually get here. Otherwise, ownership would revert back to Britain. The size and weight of the gun, cradle, undercarriage, and bogies weighed 185 tons, while the gun itself weighed 45 tons. Several attempts were made to organise transport for the Amiens gun, resulting in a litany of freighter captains cancelling the arrangements, as it was no secret that it would be a risky journey to stow such a bulky, weighty, and awkward cargo in any ship likely to encounter heavy seas. Enter Captain Waldron, an experienced shipmaster who, prior to the war, had routinely worked a route from Esperance to Albany in Western Australia. Waldron was in command of the SS Dongara, itself an Australian trophy, and formerly called the Stensenfels. Waldron readily accepted the request and stated that the task was a great privilege. Prior to the loading, a wooden model of the undercarriage as well as the hatch of the Dongara had been constructed to test whether or not it would actually fit. Fortunately, it did, and arrangements were made to clear the Chatham docks and to facilitate the use of the large freight crane there to enable the loading of the gun, carriage, cradle, and bogies. The manifest also included spare barrels of the Indefatigable class battlecruiser HMAS Australia, and everything was safely loaded into Dongara's hold. Much like the fate of Mephisto, when Dongara departed the Chatham docks in October 1919, its final destination wasn't particularly clear. However, unlike Mephisto, a lot of the decision making was made well before it left Britain. Multiple states requested the gun. Queensland and West Australia, mainly because the sappers who captured it hailed from there. Victoria put in a request, mainly because the 31st Battalion was raised there. While state governments were the main petitioners, towns also requested the gun. The town of Penrith, New South Wales, specifically also made a request, as it, at the time, sat at the end of the Western Rail Line and had a suitable rail yard to house and display it. However, the decision was made purely based on a matter of logistics. Owing to the relatively young age of the nation, there was no standardized rail network, as infrastructure was developed on a colony-by-colony basis. Those wishing to travel from the north of Queensland to the south of Victoria would have to change trains twice, both times at the respective New South Wales borders, not just for the matter of customs, but also at the time there were 3 separate railway gauges in use: narrow, standard, and broad, something that would take 94 years to standardise. New South Wales was, at the time, the only state to have a standard gauge railway, as well as possessing cranes with enough strength to remove the Amiens gun from the Dongara and transfer it to a nearby rail line. Prior to the departure of the Dongara, the general manager of the Broken Hill Proprietary Company, who fortunately was in London at the time on business, offered to place all company facilities and personnel located at the port of Newcastle at the disposal of the government. Back then, as now, Port Newcastle on the New South Wales northern coast is a massive deepwater port used primarily for the unloading and loading of raw materials. It is currently the world's largest coal port. This would have been perfect, even with the weight limits on the bridges on the Newcastle-Sydney rail line being much lower than the gun itself, something that could be remedied with transporting the gun dismantled on flatbed rolling stock. That was until it was revealed that the floating naval crane Titan at Garden Island Naval Base, with its capacity for 200 tons, was available and could be transferred to Sydney's Darling Harbour, and the decision was made to offload the gun there instead for the short transit to the Everleigh train yards in Redfern for reassembly. The Premier of New South Wales had also agreed to construct a new rail spur near the Sydney Rail Terminal, otherwise known as Central, to display the gun and carriage once it had been reassembled. The location of this spur is now just beyond platforms 22 and 23 at the corner of the Elizabeth Street and Eddy Avenue, which was fine. However, within a month of it being on display from the 26th of March 1920, under floodlights, the embankment started to collapse. While work was done to shore it up, on the 17th of April, the gun rolled forward off the end of the embankment and derailed. Technically speaking, the Amiens gun was the property of the Commonwealth Government and only stored on display in Sydney due to logistics. It was the intention of the Australian War Museum Committee, the successor to the Australian War Records Section and predecessor to the Australian War Memorial, that the gun should remain on display in a densely populated area until it could be moved to the new Australian Federal Territory. It was this requirement that disqualified Penrith, a largely rural area at the time, from receiving the gun. Notwithstanding the energetic campaigning by George Burrows' father Edward, who was the champion for getting the Amiens gun to Penrith, he became the leading voice to getting the Penrith Memory Park Memorial opened. As someone who grew up in Penrith and spent most of my life there, I have visited this park several times and actually have photos of it from my last time there on the podcast website and on Facebook and Instagram. Unfortunately, the planned expansion of the Central Railway Station interfered with the plans to keep the gun in Sydney. While initially the Amiens gun was relocated around the site so not to interfere with the expansion, the repeated reinforcement of retaining walls and bridges to facilitate the positioning of the gun started to become cost prohibitive. It would have been simply cheaper to move the gun to Canberra than to continue to move the gun around Sydney's Central Railway Station. As a result, the AWM committee reluctantly agreed to fund the transfer of the Amiens gun south to Canberra, though in 1922, what would become the Bush capital was still very much a construction site. As a result, the initial destination of the Amiens gun was going to be Queanbeyan, which sits on the border between New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. The other reason for this decision was that while the rail gauge in Canberra was standard gauge, the jurisdiction on the tracks beyond that point fell to the federal government, and there were concerns on whether or not this new line could take the weight of the gun. As conversations happened at higher levels of government pertaining to Amiens gun's fate, John Henry Palmer married Florence Lila Fleming on the 20th of February 1922 in Gympie in Queensland. By this point in time, Palmer had also been promoted to the position of boiler inspector for the Queensland Railway. In February 1923, the Commonwealth Railways Engineer Weigh and Works certified the Canberra rail line as suitable for the Amiens gun, which finalised its destination. In early March, the Amiens gun was moved once more to the Everleigh train yards for a service in preparation for the longest journey the gun would take to date. Once completed on the 16th of May 1923, the Amiens gun headed to Canberra. Despite its celebrity status, the Amiens gun was still beholden to the New South Wales Railways train timetable, and the speed limit placed upon the rolling stock weighing close to 200 tonnes. As it travelled south, it drew impressive crowds at each of the towns along what is now the T8 South Line, travelling at a glacial 12 miles per hour or 19 kilometres per hour, before finally stopping for the night in Goulburn and the freight hub located there. There were two bridges of concern, both were towards the end of the gun's journey, the bridge crossing the Molongo River at the side of the current Kings Highway, and the bridge crossing the Queanbeyan River. The New South Wales Railway was already in the process of modernising both of these bridges well before the move was proposed, but still felt the need to include the costs of reinforcing both bridges in their expense report to the AWM committee. After an uneventful journey, the Amiens gun arrived in Canberra, where an estimated 2,200 schoolchildren had seen the gun on its journey. A temporary site for the gun had been located in a position in the vicinity of the Molongo Camp railway siding. The original location in Canberra for the Amiens gun was in a loop siding at the old Molongo internment camp. During the war, the camp was established in secrecy in February 1918 in response from the British government asking if Australia could provide a short-term internment camp for German and Austrian nationals who'd been expelled from China when they entered the war on the side of the Allies on the 4th of August 1917. Though by 1919, the last of these detainees had been deported and most of the buildings had been either sold off or moved on. After the war, the Molongo settlement, as it had been renamed, had been used by work details tasked with building Canberra. The Australian War Museum Committee, concerned about what had happened in Sydney repeating in Canberra, wrote to the Commonwealth Railways to ensure that the new temporary home of the Amiens gun could take the weight for a prolonged period. After receiving assurances that the loop siding could take the weight and arranged for the caretaker of the camp to keep a general watch of the gun, it was installed in place. There, however, was a slight hurdle that needed to be overcome, as the platform used by residents of the camp was all located on the same loop, meant that the interstate train could no longer stop at the station, and by the end of 1923, the location of the gun was causing concern. The residents of the Molongo settlement had become frustrated as passengers had to detrain from the main line by way of a stepladder if they wanted to alight or exit the regular service, as trains couldn't use the service loop. In 1924, the Molongo platform closed and the gun was moved to the Canberra goods shed. However, with the absence of a caretaker, the AWM committee grew concerned about the prospect of vandalism on the gun and requested the government for a fence for around the installation. As the government had no intention of footing the bill when the AWM committee lacked the funds to build one, the gun was, as you would expect, routinely vandalised. 1927 marked the next big milestone for both the gun and the men who captured it. On the 9th of March 1927, it marked the wedding of Lieutenant George Burrows to Eva Jessie Watts, who tied the knot at St Stephen's Church in Sydney. In May, to coincide with the arrival of His Royal Highness the Duke of York to open Federal Parliament in the building that is now the Museum of Australian Democracy on the 9th, the Amiens gun was relocated to a new location in the Canberra railway station, where it would sit on a new concrete base. It was also placed under electric floodlights, and this move coincided with a tree planting program throughout Canberra in June, which resulted in the Amiens gun being screened by an outcropping of trees near the station. The following year, the Burrows would welcome their first child, a daughter, and Margaret. In that year, the final construction plans for the Australian War Memorial would be announced. The plan called for the Amiens gun to be on display on the grounds of the memorial from the onset. Now, despite receiving a facelift and a light fence to discourage access, the gun would remain on the Canberra railway station until the outbreak of the Second World War, where it and Lieutenant Burrows would go on to serve once more. The Burrows would welcome two more children before the start of the war, in 1927 and 1934, a son, John George, and a daughter, Mary Jocelyn. Owing to his age at the outbreak of the Second World War, while he was accepted, he was prevented from serving overseas. Instead, he was assigned to the Royal Australian Engineers as a captain tasked with training officers. At this point in history, Palmer is still working for the Queensland Railway, but now holds the position of Chief Boiler Inspector for the Queensland Railways, and at the outbreak of the war, he would return to work at the Ipswich Railway Workshop. For Strahan, he's still living in Fremantle, but with his wife and two children, Ronald and Alan, and in 1943 he was working as a shopkeeper. The Amiens gun itself, despite its own advanced age, was also destined for home war service, with the War Office showing great interest in the railway mounting for testing heavy guns after relining. So the Inspector General of Munitions approached the AWM committee, requesting its transfer for war service at the Proof and Experimental Establishment at Port Wakefield in South Australia. As only parts of the gun would be required, the War Memorial Committee sought assurances that once the war was over, that the gun would be reassembled in Canberra. In September 1942, the process of dismantling the gun was done on a special railway siding in Canberra by way of a heavy lift railway crane that had arrived from Sydney. However, the dismantling and preparation caused severe damage to the surrounding rail line. It would take close to a year to fully prep the required components of the Amiens gun for transport, much to the frustration of the Canberra station master, who demanded the offending components be removed from his rail line. On the 20th of October 1943, notice was given to the New South Wales Railway Commissioner that the gun would be departing Canberra bound for Albury on the New South Wales-Victorian border, where the mounting would be removed from its bogies and then placed on 3 Victorian railway flat cars for the journey to South Australia. Remember, even after the arrival of the Amiens gun, the state still lacked a unified rail network. The bogies would be initially stored at a railway siding in Albury, but ultimately they were transferred to a storage facility in Victoria. The gun itself, as well as the covered engineer shed, being not required for war service, were left in Canberra. At the conclusion of the Second World War, the now open Australian War Memorial had made inquiries to the Inspector General of Munitions about getting the mounting and bogies returned as promised. In 1948, the Inspector General of Munitions requested that the mounting be retained by the Army indefinitely, which was approved, albeit begrudgingly. On the 14th of April 1950, Leslie Jane Strahan was working as a clerk for the Royal Australian Air Force at RAF Base Pearce Station in Bullsbrook. While working there, he was involved in a car crash that resulted in a compound fracture of his right leg. 2 years later, at the age of 59, Sapper Leslie James Strahan, military medal, would pass away in his sleep. He'd be honoured as an honorary member of the RAF Sergeant's Mess at RAF Pearce. He'd be cremated at the Karrakatta Cemetery in Perth, where his ashes were scattered. He was survived by his wife and 2 children. 2 years after the death of one of its original captors, the memorial was informed by the Department of Supply that the Amiens gun's mounting was no longer required by the Army, and discussions began in regards to reuniting it, the bogies, and the gun barrel. The conversation went on for several years and involved both the ACT Tourist Bureau and the Return Services League. Despite initial assurances at the start of the Second World War that the gun would be restored to its original condition at the war's end, and all expenditure in connection therein would be held by the Department of the Army, by the end of the 1950s, the cost estimates associated with the transport, relocation of parts, and reassembly exceeded the will of the Army to actually fulfill that promise. In August 1958, the Australian War Memorial decided to place the barrel on its grounds, where it sits on the western side of the building pointed towards Lake Burley Griffin on a concrete casement built to resemble the original mounting, where it has been reunited with the engineer's canopy. As for the rest of the gun, in July, the decision was made that any part of the Amiens gun not currently in Canberra was to be disposed of, in a move that's seen by many as highly controversial. A South Australian scrap metal firm was awarded the contract of, quote, mutilating the gun mounting, unquote, which took over a week to cut up. The bogies were also scrapped in Bandiana, where they had been stored for nearly 20 years. Sapper John Henry Palmer, military medal, would join his battle brother Strahan when he too passed away on the 17th of August 1966 at the age of 73. He was buried in Chelmer, Queensland, and is survived by his wife Florence and a child that neither I nor Laurie could identify. George Burrows, MC and Bar, would complete his war service in the Second World War on the 2nd of August 1945 at the rank of Major. Following being reclassified D2 due to his sudden loss of hearing in his right ear, he would continue to live independently until he had a stroke at the age of 92. He would pass away 2 years later on the 20th of July 1984 at the age of 94. His wife Ava sadly passed away when their second daughter was very young. He was survived by his second daughter Jocelyn and his son John. As has been common of the men I've covered in this podcast, all 3 men were reluctant to speak about their experiences in the Great War, and George even went so far as to refuse to be acknowledged at the public reception held when the Amiens gun was unveiled in Sydney. And when he did speak to his family about his experiences in the war, it was when his grandson was a teenager, and even then only did so in the broadest of terms. So gentlemen, for this I say, your legacy is held in a place of pride here in the heart of the land you loved, and your story will never be forgotten, and for that, I thank you, and we are eternally grateful. Before I wrap up the episode, I do have to point something out as well. So Australian troops also captured the Tunis railway gun, but because it had been concreted in place and had been destroyed by the retreating German soldiers, no attempt was made to bring it to Australia, bar some artifacts attached to it. Instead, it was given to the city of Villers-Bretonneux, and where it sat there until it was destroyed by German forces in the Second World War. However, it is technically the largest war trophy collected by the Australian Imperial Force. But the Amiens gun has the distinction of being the largest one that was brought back. And there you have it, folks. That's the story behind the Amiens gun and the men who captured it. Works cited in this episode are numerous and too many to mention in an already very long episode, so the complete listing will be up on the podcast website. But the main sources are the unit diaries of the 31st Australian Infantry Battalion, the 8th Australian Infantry Brigade, and the 8th Field Company Engineers, the service records of Lieutenant George Burrows, Sapper John Henry Palmer, and Sapper Leslie James Strahan, the Great War Forum entry on the Amiens gun, the trove online newspaper archives from the National Library of Australia, the websites of the Australian War Memorial, the Canadian War Memorial, the Imperial War Museum, reliving the memories from the Woollahra Municipal Council Centenary Project, the biographical dictionary entry on the Leslie James Strahan, the Australian Army Historical Unit's journal entry into the Amiens gun, how a man from the Ipswich Railway Workshops captured the Amiens railgun from the Queensland Museum, the Engineers Heritage Australian magazine article on the Amiens gun, and the Battle of the Amiens Centenary and the Capture of the Amiens gun by Jeff Hopkins Weiss and Robert Shields. Now this is the last episode of the year, it's time to go through the stats and milestones. So at present, Spotify is still the largest singular destination for listenership with 155 followers, of which 85% of them joined us this year. So welcome, folks. For 97 of these followers, their podcast is in their top 10. It's the top 5 for 64 of them, and the top podcast for 27 people. So thank you. And if you are one of those 27, please let us know. Reach out to us on the podcast. This is amazing. The most popular episode overall has been The Hero of Kokoda, Part 1, Captain Ralph Honor, The Battle of Bardia, with 420 listens. It's currently topping the charts across every platform. Now, despite Ashburn, Virginia currently dominating the listener chats at the moment, Australia across all platforms is the podcast's #1 country. And this year, we also made the milestone of 17,000 plays on Spotify. Over on Apple Podcasts, which is the only other service that gives us stats, the podcast has 68 followers and 484 plays total. Despite this, over 61% of all listeners are not on either of these platforms, so I don't know anything about them though. So to date, all of the podcast reviews have come from Apple Podcasts. This year we gained another one from Stephanie69. She gave us 5 stars, and with the quote, "If Mark Corrigan was Australian. Fascinating military history of Australia, very well made and intriguing." Now I had to Google who Mark Corrigan is. I can understand it, I can see it, but I would never have made the connection myself. But this year also marked the first year the podcast was on YouTube in its entirety. So at the moment, it's only in audio format, but there is a plan of getting video content out there as well. This is usually where all of the information from Reels and TikTok end up, as well as Shorts. But almost immediately after putting the podcast on YouTube, we've gained 46 new subs, and this year has hit the milestone almost immediately of 10.9 thousand views. So this also marked the first year of our Ko-Fi and Patreon sponsorship, and all the money gone there will go towards digitization and the collection of records and information for the podcast. So everyone, from the half of me and Laurie, thank you for your continued support. Thank you for 2023, and we'll see you all again next year. Bye. I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, is made possible thanks to the generous support from each and every one of you, but in particular, our Armoured Emu Brigade community. Now, if you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so over on our social media channels. At this point, the podcast is on everything. And if you want to join the Armoured Emu Brigade community, you can do so over on our Discord server. Links to everything are on our website as well as in the episode description. But if you want to support the podcast, you now have 2 options. You can either buy the podcast a one-off coffee or join us on Patreon for ongoing support. Each cent given goes directly into digitalization of records, as well as distribution and licensing. Now, if you enjoy this or any other episode in the series, please leave a review or share it with a friend, as it is the best way to get the show in the ears of people who need to hear it. Until next time, friends, catch you then. Bye. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job Australia's Military History Podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Gangdangara people, whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This episode was written, researched, produced, directed, and audio engineered by me, Ross, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. If you do know someone whose story needs to be told, feel free to leave a comment on an episode or send us an email at iwasonlydoingmyjobpod@gmail.com. If you like what we do here and you want to support this podcast, the best thing you can do is share this with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, as it really helps others find the show. And if you want to join in on the conversation, join us over on Discord. And if you want more content, including show notes, photos, transcripts, and my various adventures finding memorials dotted around Australia, head over to our website at www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on all our social media pages at IWODMJ. Don't worry, there are links to everything in the show notes. Join me personally for more bite-sized history over on TikTok and pretty much everywhere else at Doc Winters. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not reflect the views or opinions of any entity, agency, or organization. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time. Bye.